Welcome to the AgManager Radio, brought to you by the Kansas State University Agricultural Economics Department. Our team of researchers and extension specialists are here to bring you commentary on the latest issues in agriculture.
Let me begin by, making the point that, many farm operators across the state know about you and all of that. But if you met someone who didn't know you and didn't know what you do, and they asked, what does Robin do? And who is Robin? What would you say?
Well, I guess I would start off by saying I do a little bit of a lot of things. I've been in K-State Research and Extension for going on 15 years now, with over 10 of those being here in the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State. And when I first started, we were implementing the 2014 Farm Bill. And so very quickly, I got involved in agricultural policy and helping farmers make that 5-year irrevocable decision between ARC and PLC back in those years. And obviously that continued with the 2018 Farm Bill, and now that's an annual decision that producers have to make. Along the way, there's been a lot of other policy issues that have came up, the ad hoc payments of the marketing facilitation, CFAP, coronavirus food assistance payments. So a big part of what I do is trying to keep on top of the agricultural policy aspect and help communicate to producers what programs are out there, what they could expect for payments, and maybe some decisions that they need to make.
So given the current situation we have with an annual instead of a 5-year farm bill, looks as if that's where we are at the moment. What's your prognosis? Are we going to see the new Congress come in and accelerate this? Do you think these guys will finish it before they go, or are we stuck in this 1-year ad hoc situation of doing the farm bill?
Well, I've actually said since the beginning of this year that we would be seeing another extension. It's just very hard to pass a farm bill in an election year. Now, assuming that happens, that we extend it again till September 2025, yes, like you said, we'll have a new Congress to work with. I do hope they can get it done. One of the things that I foresee is we have some tough times coming in agriculture. If you look at commodity prices, with the exception of cattle right now and some of the livestock, we are in some pretty depressed prices. And I don't see anything up ahead in the near term that's going to pull us out of that quickly. So I think there's going to be some real conversation next year when we look at the support that farmers and ranchers are going to need across the U.S. and support for that farm bill to be passed and enhanced with some better safety nets for our producers.
So what are some of the things that you think we should be focusing on in addressing these impending challenges that face crop producers across the country?
Well, in the short term, I think what is really going to become critical again is just the financial management of the farm. So we're not in a place that we haven't been recently. If you think back to 2014 to 2015, how we measure it here is our Kansas Farm Management Association farms. They experienced the biggest drop in net farm income that we ever recorded, going back, well past the 1980s. So it was a time that we really had to tighten our belts and get through those next 4 or 5 years. And so the management of that operation financially became very critical. We had a lot of farmers that had to go ahead and reevaluate their loan situation, maybe take some of that operating loan and put it back onto a land loan, going backwards on where they wanted to be, but just freeing up some capital and some cash to get through the next few years. So right now, my advice to producers would be just be prepared, be vigilant, start running some budgets for next year already, and start thinking about keeping more cash on hand than you might have in the last few years that have been good. Hopefully you have some reserves built up that you can use to get through these next kind of tighter times.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the importance of cash, and we hear that cash is king. During the 2008 financial crisis, of the three automobile manufacturers in this country, we had Ford sitting on a lot of cash. And that put them in a position where they didn't need a government bailout. They were the only large company that didn't need automobile company that didn't need a government bailout. So there is significant evidence of that cash management ability to put us in a more comfortable situation when the environment is extremely tight, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the one demographic I really worry about in this situation is our young and beginning farmers that don't have that leverage, that don't have that extra capital. And these are going to be tough times for our producers that are just getting into the industry. So one thing that I always kind of watch, and that has continued to be the trend with our last census of agriculture, we continue to see fewer and larger farms across the US and here in Kansas. And interestingly, the ones that we're losing are the ones in the middle. So if we look at kind of the bottom end, those are more kind of not necessarily hobby farms, but smaller farms in the amount of acreage, smaller farms in the amount of dollars of production that they produce. And then on the top end, you also have what we think of as large farms. Some of them might be corporate, but a lot of them are still family-owned farms, but they have been increasing on the top end, over 2,000 acres, over 500,000 in net farm income. But what we're losing are the ones in the middle that can't necessarily make a living just by farming and support a family. So as those numbers continue to go down, again, we're seeing the smaller and larger farms increasing. But by far, that group of larger farms produces most all of the production in ag in our country.
Yeah, no, I mean that's the reality of, they are not big enough to be a large farm, and they are not small enough to be a small farm. And so then they get lost in the whole process of what do we do with them. Even looking at USDA programs that are targeting the industry, these guys in the middle often get into that squeeze where you can't put them into sometimes you can't put them into any of the buckets that are available for them to benefit from some of the programs that are out there.
Yeah, and USDA has done a lot of work trying to support those middle-sized farms and the family farms. But unfortunately, we do see the trend continue. And a lot of that is just because also the young people returning to agriculture. We have the baby boomer generation of farmers right now that are currently retiring. Land is changing hands, whether on the open market or to the heirs of the family that didn't come back to the farm. And maybe they retain ownership of it as the landowner and rent it out, but they could be sitting hundreds of miles away in a city or, in a different state than Kansas here. So things are shifting in agriculture right now. We're going to continue to see this trend, I'm afraid, no matter what programs are in place.
So let's shift from policy a little bit, public policy, and look at the management aspects. Looking at the beginning farmers, if you stretch back a little bit, because there are things that we can learn, or something that you probably have thought about how do we, if you strip all support and you just focus on a beginning farmer that is trying to manage growth of a farm business, what are some of the success strategies that they might be thinking about or could be thinking about to position them in the impending tough times?
Well, unfortunately, one of the biggest advantages is just returning to existing operation and maybe expanding that in some capacity so that the young farmer coming in has a role in the farm other than just being a farm hand. And at some point, maybe taking more of the management experience as the older generation retires. The hard thing is that the young person that wants to come in that doesn't have an existing opportunity to return and trying to build the operation from scratch. As we've seen recently, land prices are just astronomical in the amount of growth that they've had lately. and kind of uncertain as we go forward where they are going to go. So that is a real risk as a young person trying to buy a piece of land and finance it and make those payments in these uncertain times. Obviously, rental agreements are a good thing for young producers to get some land and get going and not have to have that capital to buy the land themselves. So the thing we always hear though is how competitive that market is. So I would suggest for young producers starting to make relationships in their local community if that's where they want to come back to, but having those personal relationships if there's a retiring farmer in the area or land transitioning to the next generation, to not necessarily have your foot in the door, but just to have the knowledge in the community that you are wanting to come back and get into farming, and maybe an opportunity will arise that would help you get started.
Do you see in the construction of these relationships for our young and aspiring producers to connect also to the local professionals, the doctors, the lawyers in town, because those are becoming important and large landowners, sometimes even from out of town. But if you buy farmland, you have to farm it, right? So is there value in helping our young producers cultivate these relationships outside agriculture so that they could generate those resources that bring them closer? In other words, it becomes, instead of a rental agreement, let's say, it becomes an ownership of shares, using the business frame of equity investors and then, skin energy or skin equity investors and cash equity investors to build this business. Are those models that we should be cultivating right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And, this couple comments on that. One, there's been some research that's been done recently asking landowners that are retired, what are your thoughts in renting to a young person or beginning farmer? And they all expressed, yes, that was the right thing to do. They want to give opportunities. But the research showed when they got right down to it, they were still more comfortable with just going with the established farmer in the area that could pay a market cash rental rate, and there wasn't the risk of that young person maybe not being able to pay their rent at the end of the season. So kind of what perception is and reality, it doesn't always line up.
Right.
The other thing I will say is our department here is doing some work to help make those relationships. So 2 years ago, we started the Office of Farm and Ranch Transition in our department. And the services we offer there, the number one is the Land Link program. So before we had this in place, we heard from landowners frequently that they wanted to retire from farming, or they were, wanting to pass this to the next generation, but didn't have a farming heir that was wanting to take that opportunity. And at the same time, we all know there's gobs of young people out there that want to get into agriculture but don't have that opportunity. And as I said earlier, getting in from the ground up, from scratch, and building that is just extremely difficult. So we've been trying to play a little bit of matchmaker in getting young people in front of these landowners, retiring farmers, and trying to not just a rental agreement, but help them through a period of time where they could establish that relationship and maybe transition in the future, between unrelated parties. So, the work is ongoing. And like I said, it's one of those things, we're not going to stop the trend, but we're at least going to help those get opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, regardless of what the trend looks like, we still got to feed people. And
Yes.
there's only one group of people that can satisfy that particular need in society, and those are farmers. And as I always say, we can feed them as Kansas farmers or US farmers, or somebody else will feed them. There isn't the option that they will not eat. It's a question of who will do the feeding, right? So given what we've done, given that U.S. agriculture remains probably the most productive, definitely the most productive in terms of, inputs to outputs globally, there is a need for us to start thinking about this transitioning, because that's what you are talking about, that from the research you are doing, looking back and then projecting it forward, this trend of changing production decision makers is going to continue. And right. And I mean, I look at the land price issue and say, producers who are retiring needs a retirement income. They need to maintain their lifestyles. And so do I rent it out to someone who now has a risk of not being able to pay? Or do I sell it to somebody who will give me that bulk cash, and I can have that in an account that is paying me annuities, so that I can maintain my lifestyle? And so for me, I'm trying to figure out how we build structures that allow us to maximize the value of the land to the current landowner and still maintain the productivity of the land in the broader business environment of maintaining agricultural production in our region. Because if we turn all this back to the prairies, as some people are pushing, we might find ourselves in a situation where our communities are under stress, and that creates its own problems for the state.
Yeah, absolutely. All of our rural communities are supported by agriculture in so many ways. And that is a thing too, as we're talking about transition and the change to fewer and larger farms. That has a huge effect in our rural communities across Kansas. As we just don't have the populations out in those areas, but we don't have the services either. We don't have the equipment dealership or the co-op or some of the input dealers. You're going to have to drive further and farther to get the resources you need to farm. So, that's one aspect of it too. But yeah, to your point, a lot of our farms, as they're building equity, as they're, the farm operator goes throughout their lifetime, a lot of that equity is in the land, and that's their retirement pool. I know a lot of farmers that do retirement accounts as well, and that is a great thing to do. If you're listening to the program, it's easy to take that money if we've had a good year in farming and go buy more land or bid and aggressively on a cash rent, but taking some of that money and setting it aside for retirement is definitely a good thing. But assuming you don't have much in that aspect and you're needing that land to support you in retirement, the current structure of capital gains taxes across the US makes it very difficult to go ahead and say, I'm going to sell a piece of ground and use that money for retirement. Well, you're going to likely have owned that ground for quite a while, and that ground has grown exponentially in value over the years. So you'll be unfortunately owing taxes at what the market value is today back to where you bought or inherited that piece of ground. And that could be a sizable difference in value. So we see a lot of producers, instead of selling, they want to retain ownership of that ground and pass that on to the next generation through a will or estate plan, where that basis resets and those capital gain taxes are not owed. So with that constraint, really brings producers that are retiring back to rental agreements, going ahead and renting that ground out and using that income for retirement. So as we get more and more into this, what we're seeing now is about half of our state, 50% of our ground in the state is being farmed by a landlord-tenant relationship. And I only see that continuing to grow.
Yeah. And then so that really makes your earlier advice of putting money away for retirement more important, because that is taxed differently than capital gains when you have that money put away into retirement. Let's circle back a little bit to something that I know you've talked about, in other situations that I've talked to you. This whole thing about land that is going into hunting. And it's in line with some of the things that we are talking about, producer comfort, as they transition and manage, the current economic environment. What are you seeing, and how is that, panning out? Is it growing? Is it just flat? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So anecdotally, wherever you go in Kansas, you do get a lot of stories of, especially anything that has pasture, rangeland on it, that we're being competitively bid against as producers by out-of-state hunters. And, I've seen it firsthand in a lot of different areas. But as a researcher, I wanted to look at quantifying that. How big of a deal is that? And what has that done to land prices? So what I did in a study last year is I looked at where our landowners are located that own ground in Kansas. And I was able to obtain a database of, I don't know any names or actual addresses of our landowners, but I do know parcels across the state and where the tax statement is going for all of those parcels. So I looked at anything that was classified as ag over 40 acres. And I was able to look back till 2015. And what is the picture of the state at that time? So back at that time, it was 84.5% of our agricultural acres in Kansas were owned by somebody still living in Kansas. And that number was actually higher than I expected. And I do understand there's some slippage in there, professional farm managers, trusts and estates, that the tax statement would be going, somewhere other than the primary owner. But nevertheless, that gave us some pretty good insight. And the interesting thing is I looked at what states are owning Kansas farm and ranch land if they're not in Kansas. And I would have expected the surrounding states, so Nebraska, Missouri, Oklahoma, Colorado. Number 2 on the list was actually Texas. So Texas owns about 2.6% of all of our Kansas agriculturally classified landowners that primarily live in Texas. And when I got to looking into that, okay, what's driving this? Interestingly, the Flint Hills area of Kansas, so kind of southeast, south central, really had the highest concentration of Texas landowners. So, obviously this points to a lot of cattle grazing as well, but oil and hunting obviously have an influence. So as I continued my research, I fast forwarded to 2022. So we had 7 years between when I initially looked at the data and in 2022. And what I looked at is what zip codes had changed in those 7 years. So assuming, most of that would have been a sale or inheritance, the owner could have moved and changed zip codes or something like that. But specifically looking at the parcels that had changed hands, there was a shift in land going out of state. So in other words, less Kansas agricultural land were owned by people living in Kansas in those 7-year time frame. And if you really drill down to what type of land that is, grass, so pasture, hay ground is what is classified as grass, was the main driver of that change. Tillable crop ground, irrigated, non-irrigated, was a very small percentage of that actual change. So again, we have been noticing these things happening, but we can also quantify them. The one caveat I do want to say, because I think as Kansas farmers and ranchers, we can maybe have some ill feelings to people that come in and buy ground and are not from our state. One of those is driven by some of these landowners don't clear their cedar trees or woody encroachment, and that is a big problem. But one advantage of this is we just have more people in the market. So I talked about from 2014 to 2015, we had this huge drop in profitability of our Kansas farms. And we continued the next 4 or 5 years at profitability levels that did not support the land values where they were after that large run up. And I think a lot of that is due to we had people that were willing to buy ground and support those prices when farmers and ranchers themselves didn't have the ability to. And as a farmer and rancher, you don't want that land going down because that is your equity as well on your balance sheet. So there are some advantages to having other players in the market when we enter these times.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, if we didn't have, or if we had better um, capital gains tax rules, a lot of our retiring farmers will have different approaches to handling these things, given that limitation. So, what do you then see that because one of the things that mainly happens when we are getting to this time crunch with cash in agriculture is we begin to look at agritourism options, and these hunting grounds become very good income sources for that, especially when the economy is this hot and people are looking for ways of, living a certain lifestyle.
Mhm.
So,
Hunting leases are definitely an opportunity. We don't have a very good handle. There's no published rates for what individuals or outfitters are paying for hunting leases, but obviously an opportunity to support farm income when we don't have the income that we need to support the family. Another thing across Kansas that has really supported family farms in recent years is windmills. We don't like them in our own backyard, but they have added a lot of money to farms in recent years, and now we're seeing solar coming in. And again, not everybody is supportive of that, but there are some very big opportunities to support agriculture with these different uses of farm ground.
right. Now, do you have any idea what the lease rates on windmills are going for? Do we have any data on that?
We don't have any published data on, what leases could be for windmills or solar, or like I mentioned, hunting. That is something that we probably should have some researchers working on here in the department. But it is very, it's kind of like leasing farm ground. Nobody really wants to say what they're paying. So it's a hard area of research, but definitely information everybody wants to know.
Am I right in thinking that if we have the wind resource available, then between wind and solar, it makes sense for the farmer to think about wind instead of solar?
Well, and it all depends what area of the state
Yeah.
you are at and what
And that's what I'm
opportunities
saying. If we have
exist.
wind available, if you look at the southwestern corridor, which is rated by NREL as one of the highest wind capturing locations in the country, actually, should we, because the competition is often between, the windmills and solar, it's a lot more difficult to get rid of windmills if you don't want them after you've put them in than it is for solar. And the other thing is that solar takes ground away, whereas windmills do not technically take a lot of the ground away. So you need a lot more footprint for solar than you do for windmills. Is that argument right? Or from your research and conversations, you've seen something different?
No, and I'm not an expert in this area, so
I
I'm
know.
not going to pretend to be. But yeah, I've actually looked more at wind energy leases from a different aspect, and that is on the foreign agricultural ownership. Because not to go out on a rabbit trail, but the data we currently have and the reporting system we currently have captures a lot of those wind energy leases in foreign agricultural holdings. Because even though they're US companies, if they have more than 10% shareholders in a foreign country, they're considering that entire leased area as having to report as foreign holdings. So that's really been my research in the area of wind energy. But what I'm told when we actually drill down to the footprint of those windmills, it's maybe 10% of the leased area. And even on a lot of the leased area, windmills may or may not ever actually be built. They've, leased it for the opportunity to do that at a later time.
Right.
And we're seeing a lot more of those solar leases for the same reason as well, that you see a lease on the ground, but those may or may not actually be built.
Mhm. Okay, wonderful. We are hitting on our time right now, and I'm cognizant of your work and time constraints. So, do you want to wrap this up with some conclusion or some direction of what you would tell producers to think about as we move forward into this end of year, middle of year, and trend that you are seeing in the research?
Well, and my advice as I started this program, it's going to be really critical to be a good manager financially going forward as we're seeing lower commodity prices. But another big area of my research is land values, and I've touched on different aspects of that throughout the podcast today. But I would just kind of be watching those values as well. Like I said, I think we're at a tipping point. The profitability in ag is still the main driver of land values. And as we've seen that leveling off and coming down, everybody wants to know that crystal ball of where our land value is going. Some people may be looking for that opportunity, as you mentioned, our off-farm income, doctors, dentists, university professors, whoever might be looking for an opportunity to buy a piece of ground, and that could be coming. But I do hope there's more of a soft landing in agriculture, that we can maintain land values kind of flat where they're at, maybe coming down a little bit like we saw in the last downturn in the farm economy. But it is definitely something to watch, because that will impact your financing ability if we do see land prices coming down at all. So I would just say be vigilant as a farm manager, always watching what's going on in agriculture, making relationships, and looking for opportunities.
And when farm managers are looking for this information to maintain their vigilance, one of the places they can come to is the K-State Agricultural Economics Department AgManager.info website.
Absolutely. And we try to keep all of the fresh material on the front page there as things are happening. We try to get articles and podcasts and things out onto the website. But I would also encourage all of us that are on the extension team here in the Agricultural Economics Department are available for a phone call or an email. If you have a question you want to ask individually, go on that agmanager.info website, look under contributors, and you will see all of our information and all of the work that we have done that our name is assigned to.
Thank you very much, Robin. We will come back to you in the near future to discuss some of the interesting work that you are doing to help Kansas farmers navigate these terrible and dangerous rivers that we are getting into in the new agricultural economy. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, Vincent.